I have always found that the aroma of expensive Kona coffee is the ultimate mask for a brewing disaster. It is rich, acidic, and smells like a lie told by someone in a custom-tailored suit. I sat in my kitchen, the morning sun slicing through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my suburban sanctuary, watching the steam rise from my mug. Across the marble island, my brother Leo was busy scrolling through his phone, his thumb moving with a frantic energy that should have been my first warning. He looked up, giving me that practiced, boyish grin that had helped him slide through life on the coattails of my effort. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. "Big day, Orion," he said, his voice vibrating with an artificial cheer. "The board meeting at 10. You ready to see the Vanton Weller legacy go global?" "I've been ready since we filed the first patent, Leo," I replied, my voice dry. I pulled my laptop toward me, intending to do a final sweep of the morning's projections. Arden and I didn't build a biotech empire just to let it sit in a petri dish. Leo nodded, took a final swig of his juice, and vanished toward the garage. I liked the silence he left behind. Silence is where the best thinking happens. It is also where the most glaring errors are found. I logged into the secure company portal, expecting to see the final draft of the acquisition agreement with the Swiss conglomerate. My eyes scanned the header, the valuation, the intellectual property transfer, and then I paused. The cursor blinked at me, a rhythmic, mocking pulse. Under the section titled Primary Stakeholders and Executive Beneficiaries, there was a list. Arden Weller was there, his name bold and arrogant. Even several of our junior partners were listed. But the space where Orion Vanton should have been was replaced by a sterile, legalistic clause about restructuring offsets. I didn't feel a sudden chill. I didn't feel my heart skip. That's for Victorian novels. Instead, I felt a sharp, crystalline clarity. It was the same feeling I get when a complex chemical reaction finally stabilizes. I moved my mouse, clicking through the deep archives of the shared drive. The metadata on the file showed it had been edited 3 hours ago from an IP address I recognized as Arden's private home office. "Arden, you predictable, greedy cliché," I whispered to the empty kitchen. It wasn't just a clerical error, it was an erasure. Arden, my partner of 15 years, the man who had stood as the best man at my wedding, was attempting to sell the company out from under me by using a loophole in our original 2018 founding charter, a loophole we had discussed closing 3 years ago. Apparently, he had decided to keep it open like a trapdoor. I checked my personal accounts. Frozen. I checked my corporate access. Restricted to read only. They hadn't just moved the goalposts, they had removed me from the stadium entirely. I sat back, the coffee now lukewarm and tasting of ash. My internal monologue, usually a quiet stream of analytical data, shifted into something more acerbic. I thought about Arden's penchant for $3,000 loafers and his pathological need to be the smartest person in any room. He clearly thought I was still the science guy, the one who lived in the lab and didn't understand the sharp edges of a contract. He thought I was a passive element in his grand experiment. He was about to learn that in any reaction, the catalyst is never consumed. It just changes the nature of everything it touches. I heard the front door open. My wife Clara walked in, balancing her yoga mat and a green smoothie. She looked at me, her brow furrowing. "You're still here? I thought you had that pre-meeting with Arden." "The plans changed," I said, my voice steady. I closed the laptop. It turns out the meeting is going to be far more exclusive than I anticipated. "Is something wrong?" she asked, leaning against the counter. I looked at her, wondering if she knew. In this house, secrets tended to grow like mold in the crawl spaces, but her expression was one of genuine, albeit distracted, concern. "Just a minor technical glitch, Clara. Arden thinks he's found a way to optimize the sale. I'm just going to ensure the optimization is thorough." I stood up and went to my study, locking the door behind me. I didn't need a lawyer yet. Lawyers were for people who wanted to play by the rules, and Arden had just set the rule book on fire. I sat at my secondary terminal, the one the company didn't know existed, linked to a private server I'd maintained since our startup days in the garage. If Arden wanted to play a game of shadows, I had a much better flashlight. I began pulling up the internal logs of his communications. He had been talking to the Swiss firm for months, and he wasn't alone. I saw a series of encrypted messages to a familiar handle. My grip tightened on the mouse. The handle belonged to Leo. My own brother was helping Arden carve me out of the deal like a Thanksgiving turkey. The betrayal was so total, it was almost impressive. It was a masterpiece of treachery, painted in the colors of familial loyalty and professional partnership. I felt a strange sense of liberation. When the people you trust most decide you are an obstacle, you are no longer burdened by the need to protect them. I spent the next hour mapping out the vulnerabilities. Arden was a creature of habit. He loved his prestige, he loved his schedule, and he loved his vintage Italian sports car. He believed that power was a matter of signatures and handshakes. He forgot that I was the one who designed the security protocols for our facility. I was the one who knew the bypass codes for every digital lock in our lives. I grabbed my jacket and my keys. I needed to see him. Not to argue, not to plead, and certainly not to offer a handshake. I needed to see the look on his face when he realized the science guy was out of the lab. I drove toward the office, the city blurring past in a smear of gray and glass. I found myself thinking of a passage I'd read once about the nature of revenge. Most people think it's a hot, impulsive thing. They're wrong. True revenge is a cold, mechanical process. It's about balance. It's about returning the universe to its proper state of equilibrium. I pulled into the executive parking garage. Arden's car, a pristine silver nightmare of engineering, was parked in his designated spot. It looked smug. I parked my SUV 3 rows back, tucked into the shadows. I didn't head for the elevator. Instead, I walked toward the maintenance corridor. I knew the service schedule. The technicians were at their break. I reached the electrical hub that fed the garage's smart grid. With a few keystrokes on my handheld device, I accessed the localized node. I didn't shut it down. That would be too obvious. Instead, I adjusted the climate control sensors and the fire suppression overrides for the executive tier. A small, subtle tweak that would cause the overhead sprinklers to test themselves at exactly the wrong moment, soaking the interior of any car with an open sunroof or a slight seal gap. Arden always left his windows cracked in the summer to keep the leather cool. It was a petty start, a mere seasoning for the main course, but it felt right. I made my way up to the executive floor via the stairs. I wanted the physical exertion. I wanted to feel the tension in my muscles. When I reached the 10th floor, I adjusted my tie in the glass of the stairwell door. I looked calm. I looked like a man ready to sign a multi-million-dollar deal. I pushed through the doors and walked past the receptionist, who was too busy with a personal call to notice the man who technically owned the floor. I walked straight toward Arden's office. I could hear his laughter through the heavy oak door. It was that boisterous, chesty laugh he used when he thought he'd won. I didn't knock. I turned the handle and stepped inside. Arden was leaning back in his chair, his feet on the desk, a glass of sparkling water in his hand. Leo was there too, sitting on the leather sofa, looking like a cat that had found the key to the creamery. They both froze. The silence that followed was heavy and thick, the kind of silence that precedes a landslide. "Orion," Arden said, his voice jumping an octave before he smoothed it out. "You're early. We were just going over the final adjustments." "I saw the adjustments, Arden," I said, walking to the center of the room. I didn't sit down. I stood there, a vertical line of correction in his crooked world. I saw the restructuring offsets. I saw the way my name just evaporated from the contract. It's a fascinating bit of legal alchemy, turning a partner into a ghost. Leo looked at his shoes. Arden, ever the performer, tried to chuckle. "Now, Orion, don't get dramatic. It's a strategic move for the tax implications. We were going to explain it to you after the signing. You'll still get your payout. It's just handled differently." "I'm sure it is," I said, leaning over his desk. I could smell his expensive cologne. It smelled like desperation masked by citrus. "But here's the thing about ghosts, Arden. They don't have anything left to lose, and they can walk through walls you thought were solid." I leaned closer, my voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a shout. "I'm not here to ask for my name back on that paper. I'm here to tell you that the paper you're so proud of is already obsolete. You think you've cut me out of the sale? I'm going to make sure there's nothing left to sell." Arden's face paled, the smugness draining away like water from a cracked vase. "You can't do anything, Orion. The board is with me. The lawyers have already vetted the move. You're out." "Out is a relative term," I said, turning toward the door. I paused and looked at Leo. "And Leo, I'd check your accounts. I noticed some irregularities in the way you've been handling the regional distributions. I'd hate for the auditors to find what I found." I didn't wait for a response. I walked out, my footsteps echoing on the polished floor. As I reached the elevator, I looked at my watch. 3, 2, 1. Down in the garage, I knew the sprinklers were currently drenching the interior of Arden's precious car with a high-pressure blast of industrial-grade gray water. It was a small, sharp sting, the first of many. As the elevator doors closed, I caught my reflection in the chrome. I wasn't the underdog anymore. I was the architect of the collapse. If Arden Weller thought he could erase me, he clearly underestimated how meticulous I can be. I hadn't just built this company. I knew where every single bolt was buried, and I was going to unscrew them all, one by one, until the whole world came crashing down on his head. The hunt had officially begun. The walk from the elevator to my SUV was a lesson in measured rhythm. I didn't rush. Rushing is the behavior of a man who is panicked, and I have never felt more in control. As I passed Arden's parking stall, the site was a minor masterpiece. The overhead suppression system had performed with surgical precision. A heavy, stagnant deluge of recycled water was gushing directly into the cabin of his silver pride and joy. The Italian leather would be bloated by noon, the intricate electronics of the dashboard short-circuited into expensive scrap metal. It was a shallow victory, perhaps, but in the architecture of a grand collapse, one must appreciate the smaller pillars as they crumble. I climbed into my own vehicle and pulled out of the garage, checking my rearview mirror. No one followed. They were too busy upstairs, congratulating themselves on a heist they hadn't actually finished. My mind was already moving 3 steps ahead, navigating the digital corridors of our corporate infrastructure. I needed more than just a ruined car. I needed the leverage that resided in the spaces between the lines of Arden's secret negotiations. The city moved around me with its usual indifference, a sea of glass and steel that favored whoever held the most recent version of the truth. My first stop wasn't the office or the lab, but a quiet, nondescript coffee shop on the edge of the financial district. This was the territory of Tara Garrison, a woman who had once been my friend and was currently the most efficient information broker in the biotech sector. If Arden was moving assets overseas, Tara would be the one holding the map. I spotted her through the window, sitting at a corner table, her eyes fixed on a tablet. I entered, the bell above the door chiming with an annoying cheerfulness. When I sat across from her, she didn't look up immediately. "You look remarkably calm for a man who was deleted from his own life this morning," she said, her voice a low, raspy velvet. "The deletion is only a temporary glitch in the system," I replied. I watched her finally raise her gaze. Her eyes were sharp, calculating the value of the information I was about to ask for. "I need the transit logs for the offshore IP transfers Arden initiated last Tuesday. I know he used your encryption services to bypass the standard board review." Tara leaned back, a small, knowing smirk playing on her lips. "Arden told me you were taking a sabbatical. He said you were burnt out, Orion, that you wanted to focus on your garden and your midlife crisis." "Arden's imagination has always been his most developed feature," I said, my voice dry. "But we both know I don't garden. I build, and right now, I'm looking to see how much of my building he's tried to ship to a shell company in the Caymans." "Information has a price, Orion, especially when I've already been paid to keep that specific set of data under wraps." I tapped my fingers on the laminate tabletop. "I'm not asking for a favor, Tara. I'm offering you an exit strategy. When the Swiss firm realizes the intellectual property they're buying is tied up in a 3-way litigation suit that I'm about to file, everyone associated with the concealment is going to be scrutinized, including the person who provided the encryption." The smirk vanished. Tara was many things, but she was not a gambler who bet against a sure thing. She slid a small, silver flash drive across the table. "He's moving the synthetic protein sequences. All of them. He's trying to create a parallel entity before the merger is finalized, so he can sell the company to the Swiss and keep the actual science for himself." "Greedy," I remarked, pocketing the drive. "He's not just betraying me, he's defrauding the buyers. That's a very dangerous game to play with people who have that much capital." "He thinks he's smarter than them," she said. "He thinks he's smarter than everyone." "That is his primary vulnerability," I said, standing up. "Thank you for the tea, Tara. I'd suggest you take a long vacation, somewhere without an internet connection." I left the shop and headed for my next target, Leo. My brother was a different kind of problem. Where Arden was driven by ego, Leo was driven by a desperate, grasping need for status. He wanted the life I had, without the 20 years of 16-hour days it took to earn it. He lived in a high-rise condo that I had co-signed for, drove a car I had gifted him, and wore watches that cost more than his annual salary. He was a creature of luxury, which meant he was incredibly easy to manipulate. I drove toward his residence, my internal commentary providing a sarcastic play-by-play of his inevitable reaction. Leo would be nervous. He would be checking his phone every 30 seconds, waiting for Arden to tell him the coast was clear. He didn't realize that the coast was currently being hit by a hurricane. I used my spare key, the one he'd forgotten I had, to enter his apartment. It was a cavern of glass and white leather, smelling of expensive cologne and anxiety. Leo was standing on the balcony, his back to me, staring out at the skyline. "The view is better when you actually own the ground beneath you, Leo," I said. He spun around, nearly dropping his phone. His face went through a rapid succession of emotions: shock, guilt, and finally a weak attempt at indignation. "Orion? What are you doing here? You can't just barge in." "I can do whatever I want in a property I'm still legally responsible for," I said, walking over to his wet bar and pouring myself a glass of water. "I just had a very enlightening conversation with Arden and Tara. It seems you've been quite busy playing the middleman." Leo's eyes darted toward the door. "I don't know what you're talking about. Arden said there was a restructuring. He said it was better for everyone." "Better for everyone usually means better for Arden and his favorite lapdog," I countered. I walked toward him, and he instinctively backed away until his heels hit the glass railing. "I'm curious, Leo. Did he promise you a seat on the new board, or did he just promise to pay off the gambling debts you've been hiding from the family?" Leo's silence was my answer. His face paled, the guilt settling into the lines of his mouth. "I needed the help, Orion. You're always so perfect, so successful. You don't know what it's like to be at the bottom." "You weren't at the bottom, Leo. You were in the middle, and I was holding the ladder. But you decided to kick it over." I took a step closer, my presence filling the small space of the balcony. "Here is how this is going to work. You're going to give me the access codes to the secondary server Arden set up in your name. If you do that, I might forget to mention your financial irregularities to the board. If you don't, I will personally ensure that your reputation in this city is so thoroughly dismantled that you won't be able to get a job managing a lemonade stand." "Arden will ruin me if I help you," Leo stammered. "Arden is currently watching his car turn into an aquarium," I said, a cold smile touching my face. "He's a little busy. I, however, have nothing but time." Leo hesitated for a long moment, his loyalty warring with his survival instinct. Survival won, as it always does with men like him. He walked over to a small safe in the wall, opened it, and handed me a tablet. "Everything is on there. The accounts, the communication logs, the offshore contracts. Just don't tell him it was me." "I make no promises to people who sell me out for a debt," I said, taking the tablet. I looked around the apartment one last time. "Enjoy the view while it lasts, Leo. The lease is up at the end of the month, and I don't think I'll be renewing it." I walked out, leaving him standing in the middle of his expensive, borrowed life. Back in my SUV, I felt the momentum building. I had the data from Tara and the access from Leo. I had the evidence of Arden's double dealing and his attempt to defraud the Swiss investors. But I wasn't ready to end it yet. A quick resolution is a mercy, and I wasn't feeling particularly merciful. I wanted Arden to feel the slow, agonizing realization that his empire was a house of cards, and I was the wind. I spent the next several hours in a darkened corner of a public library, using their secure network to begin the psychological phase of the operation. I sent a series of anonymous, encrypted emails to the lead negotiators at the Swiss firm. No accusations, just questions. Questions about the validity of the patent transfers. Questions about the true ownership of the synthetic protein sequences. Just enough to plant the seeds of doubt. Investors are like skittish horses. Once they smell smoke, they start looking for the exit. Then, I turned my attention back to Arden. I knew he was likely at a high-end restaurant by now, trying to salvage his day after the disaster in the garage. I accessed the restaurant's reservation system and adjusted his seating. I moved him from his preferred private booth to a table in the center of the room, directly under a noisy air conditioning vent. Then, I sent a tip to a local business journalist about a major secret announcement happening at that very location. By the time I was finished, my eyes were tired, but my mind was humming. I could picture Arden sitting there, surrounded by cameras and questions he wasn't prepared to answer, while his phone buzzed with alerts from the Swiss firm demanding clarification on the contracts. As the sun began to set, casting long, jagged shadows over the city, I realized that I had moved from being a victim to being a ghost in his machine. He would see my hand in everything, but he wouldn't be able to touch me. He would feel the walls closing in, the air getting thinner, and the ground becoming unstable. I leaned back in my seat, the glow of the laptop screen illuminating the sharp angles of my face. The first act was over. The betrayers were scattered, and the foundation of their scheme was cracked. But the gala was coming up, the grand stage where Arden expected to take his final bow. I had a much different finale in mind. I closed the laptop with a satisfying click. The silence in the car was no longer empty. It was filled with the blueprints of a total, calculated collapse. Arden thought he had erased me, but he had only succeeded in removing my inhibitions. The city at night is a grid of light and shadow, a massive circuit board where everyone is trying to find a connection that doesn't cost them their soul. I sat in the back of a nondescript sedan I'd rented under a corporate alias, watching the entrance of the glass pavilion. This was the site of the annual biotech Vanguard dinner, a room filled with the very people Arden was trying to impress with his stolen brilliance. It was the perfect ecosystem for a predator who dressed in silk, and an even better one for a man intent on systematic dismantling. My internal commentary was a rhythmic pulse of cold logic. Arden would be inside, likely wearing his signature smirk and a tuxedo that cost more than a lab assistant's annual salary. He would be holding a glass of something vintage, telling anecdotes about innovation and visionary leadership, while carefully omitting the fact that the person who actually did the envisioning was currently sitting in a dark car across the street. I opened my laptop, the screen illuminating the cabin with a pale, clinical glow. Thanks to the access codes I'd extracted from Leo, I was now a silent passenger in the building's internal network. The glass pavilion was a marvel of modern architecture, which meant it was entirely dependent on a centralized digital nervous system. I navigated through the layers of security, bypassing the firewalls with the ease of someone who had written the original prototypes for these very systems. First, I looked at the guest list. Tara Garrison was there, as expected. She was probably nursing a drink and looking for the nearest exit, realizing that her involvement with Arden was becoming a liability. I sent a short, encrypted burst to her phone. "The Swiss are asking questions. You should probably be the one to answer them first." I watched through the window as a woman in a shimmering emerald gown checked her phone, went visibly rigid, and immediately headed for the coat check. One down. Next, I focused on the evening glass-walled presentation room. Arden had planned a keynote speech, a victory lap before the final signatures were dry on the Swiss deal. He had a slide deck prepared, a series of polished graphics showing the future of Arden Weller. I didn't delete the file. That would be crude. Instead, I opened the presentation and began making subtle, devastating edits. I replaced the projected revenue charts with the actual offshore accounts I'd found on Leo's tablet. I swapped out the team leadership slide for a high-resolution scan of the original founding charter, specifically highlighting the clause he had tried to use to erase me. I timed the transitions to trigger every 60 seconds, a slow-motion unraveling of his narrative. I checked my watch. 8:15 p.m. The dinner was in full swing. It was time for a more personal touch. I stepped out of the car, adjusting my own tuxedo. I wasn't on the official guest list anymore, but I knew the service entrance codes. I walked through the kitchen, the air thick with the smell of seared scallops and professional stress. The staff didn't give me a second glance. A man walking with purpose in a high-end suit is invisible in a place like this. I made my way to the mezzanine, a shadowed gallery that overlooked the main ballroom. From here, the scene was a theater of the absurd. I saw Arden at the center of a circle of investors, his gestures wide and theatrical. He looked triumphant. Beside him, Marcus Hale, a minor rival with a major appetite for gossip, was nodding along, likely hoping for a crumb of the acquisition pie. I watched as Arden checked his watch, signaled to the tech crew, and moved toward the podium. The room dimmed. The spotlight found him. He looked like a king about to announce a new age. "Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, and friends," Arden began, his voice amplified and smooth. "Today marks the beginning of a transformation. We aren't just selling a company, we are scaling an idea that began in a small lab 15 years ago." He didn't mention me. He didn't even use the word "we" in a way that implied a partnership. It was a solo performance. "Our projected growth," he continued, gesturing to the massive screen behind him, "is based on a foundation of absolute transparency and fiscal integrity." The first slide appeared. Instead of the growth chart, a giant image of a bank statement from a Cayman Islands shell company filled the screen. The room went quiet. Not the quiet of respect, but the heavy, awkward silence of a crowd witnessing a public accident. Arden didn't see it at first. He kept talking about market penetration, while the investors in the front row began to whisper. Marcus Hale pulled out his phone, his thumb blurring as he likely began texting every contact in his directory. Finally, Arden noticed the shift in energy. He turned around, his face illuminated by the bright blue glow of his own financial secrets. His reaction was priceless. It wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow, agonizing realization. He froze, his mouth slightly open, the microphone picking up the sharp, ragged intake of his breath. "There seems to be a technical error," he stammered, frantically waving at the tech booth. I clicked a button on my handheld device. The next slide transitioned. It was a photo of the original contract, the one with my signature prominently displayed, followed by a highlighted transcript of his private messages to the Swiss firm about neutralizing the founding partner. The murmurs in the room turned into a low roar of conversation. People weren't just whispering, they were pointing. The Swiss lead negotiator, a man whose face was carved from granite, stood up and walked out of the room without a word. I leaned over the railing, catching Arden's eye for a split second. I didn't wave. I didn't smile. I just watched. He saw me, and for the first time in a decade, I saw genuine terror in his eyes. He knew. He knew the science guy wasn't just in the room. He was in the walls. Arden scrambled off the stage, abandoning the podium like a sinking ship. He pushed through the crowd, heading for the side exit that led to the private offices. I met him there. I took the service stairs and arrived at the corridor just as he burst through the double doors, his face a frantic mask of sweat and ruined pride. "Orion," he hissed, looking around to see if we were alone. "What are you doing? You're ruining everything. This deal is worth billions." "It was worth billions, Arden," I said, leaning against the wall, my hands in my pockets. "Now it's worth a series of uncomfortable conversations with the Securities and Exchange Commission. I hope you kept the receipts for those offshore transfers. They're going to be very interested in the fiscal integrity you mentioned upstairs." "I'll sue you," he spat, taking a step toward me. "I'll tie you up in court for the rest of your life." "With what money?" I asked. "The Swiss firm just pulled their letter of intent. I saw their lead guy leave, and I've already contacted the board. They're holding an emergency session in 20 minutes to discuss your immediate suspension. It turns out that using company resources to hide personal assets is a breach of your fiduciary duty. Who knew?" Arden's bravado finally cracked. He slumped against the wall, the expensive tuxedo suddenly looking like a costume that didn't fit. "Why? We could have both been wealthy beyond imagining." "I was already wealthy, Arden. I had a company I built, a partner I trusted, and a reputation that was spotless. You're the one who decided those things weren't enough. You wanted to be the only name on the door. Well, now you're the only name on the indictment." A noise from the ballroom, the sound of raised voices and the flash of cameras, reminded us that the drama was spilling over. The journalist I'd tipped off had clearly arrived. "You're a monster," Arden whispered. "No," I corrected him, straightening my jacket. "I'm a scientist. I observed a toxin in the system, and I applied the appropriate neutralizer. The reaction is just following its natural course." I turned and walked away, leaving him in the dim light of the hallway. As I reached the exit, I saw Leo standing by the bar, looking like he wanted to vanish into the woodwork. I didn't stop to talk to him. He was already a ghost. He just didn't know it yet. I walked out of the glass pavilion and into the cool night air. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A news alert. Vanton Weller merger collapses amid scandal. I climbed into my car and sat for a moment. The silence of the cabin a stark contrast to the chaos I'd left behind. The revenge was far from over. Arden still had his house, his remaining private accounts, and the stubborn belief that he could claw his way back. He didn't realize that I hadn't just attacked his deal, I had poisoned his brand. In this industry, a name is everything, and his name was now synonymous with a spectacular public failure. I put the car in gear and drove away from the lights. My internal monologue was quiet now, a steady hum of satisfaction. I had dismantled his professional life in a single evening. Tomorrow, I would begin on his personal one. There was a car chase in his future, not one involving speed and tires, but a chase through the legal and financial wreckage he had created, with me always one turn ahead. As the skyline receded in the mirror, I realized I hadn't thought about the money once. This wasn't about the payout. It was about the architecture of justice. It was about showing a man who thought he could rewrite history that some ink is permanent. The aftermath of the gala felt like the cooling of a heavy engine. The city lights flickered past as I steered my SUV away from the wreckage of Arden's reputation, but the night was far from over. My dashboard glowed with a series of alerts. I had set a digital perimeter around Arden's remaining liquid assets, and the icons were flashing amber. He was moving, not just metaphorically, but physically. A GPS tracker, which I had discreetly authorized for corporate fleet management months ago, showed his vehicle, a secondary luxury sedan he'd scrambled into after the garage incident, tearing away from the pavilion toward the north side of the city. He wasn't going home. He was heading toward the private airfield where he kept his fractional ownership jet. Arden was a man who believed that if he could just change his physical coordinates, the consequences of his actions wouldn't be able to find him. It was a charmingly outdated philosophy. "Leo, pick up," I said, hitting the hands-free dial. My brother's voice was a jagged mess of static and stuttering. "Orion? Look, I had nothing to do with what happened at the gala. I didn't know you were going to—" "Save the script for the deposition, Leo. I know you're in the car with him. I can hear the engine whine of that overpriced coupe you insisted the company lease for you." There was a long pause. "He says he can fix it," Leo whispered, his voice cracking. "He says there's a backup server in the hangar, documents that prove you authorized the offshore shifts. He says he's going to flip the narrative. He's lying to you, Leo. He's using you as a shield so he can reach the tarmac. If you're in that car when he tries to bypass the airfield security, you're not a witness anymore. You're an accomplice to a flight from pending litigation." I swung my SUV onto the expressway, the tires humming against the asphalt. The distance between us was closing. Arden was fast, but he was driving with the frantic, erratic energy of a cornered animal. I was driving with the steady, calculated intent of a machine. My internal commentary was a dry observation of the physics involved. Momentum is a difficult thing to arrest once it has been fully engaged, and Arden had spent years building up a massive amount of moral momentum in the wrong direction. The chase wasn't about speed, it was about positioning. I navigated the late-night traffic with a clinical efficiency, weaving through the gaps while keeping my eyes on the shimmering red dot on my tactical display. Arden took the exit for the industrial park, a shortcut that bypassed the main highway tolls. It was a smart move, or it would have been if I hadn't already anticipated it and alerted the private security firm that patrolled the area about a stolen corporate vehicle, matching his description. I saw them a half-mile ahead, 2 sets of taillights dancing through the shadows of the warehouse district. Arden's sedan was leading, with Leo's coupe trailing behind like a nervous shadow. I floored the accelerator, the engine of my SUV roaring in a low, guttural protest. "Leo," I said, my voice dropping to a calm, terrifying register. "Pull over. Now. If you stay behind him, you're going down with the ship, and I promise you that ship is currently made of lead." "I can't. He has the keys to my secondary account. If I let him go, I lose everything." "You've already lost everything, Leo. The only thing left to decide is how much time you spend explaining yourself to the authorities." I saw Leo's brake lights flicker. He was wavering. I pulled up alongside him, the side mirror of my SUV inches from his door. I glanced over. My brother's face was a pale blur behind the glass, eyes wide and unfocused. I gave him a single, sharp nod. Leo slammed on the brakes. His coupe screeched, fishtailing across the damp pavement before coming to a smoking halt in the middle of the road. I didn't stop to check on him. I had one target left. Arden realized he was alone now. He accelerated, his sedan leaping forward toward the gates of the airfield. He was less than a mile from the hangar. I could see the perimeter fence, the high-intensity halogen lights casting a clinical glare over the tarmac. I reached out and tapped a command on my dashboard tablet. The secondary server Leo had mentioned wasn't a physical box in a hangar. It was a cloud-based mirror I had compromised 3 hours ago. I didn't delete his backup files. I simply encrypted them with a key that only responded to my biometric signature. Then, I triggered the remote immobilizer on his vehicle, a standard feature for high-end corporate leases that Arden had forgotten he'd signed off on during a late-night board meeting 3 years ago. Arden's car didn't crash. It simply died. The engine cut out, the power steering vanished, and the sophisticated electronics dimmed into a dark, silent void. The sedan coasted for a few hundred yards before rolling to a pathetic stop just short of the main gate. I pulled up behind him, my headlights illuminating the back of his head. He sat there for a moment, his hands still gripped tight on the steering wheel, staring at the gate he couldn't reach. I climbed out of my SUV and walked toward his window. The air smelled of burnt rubber and the ozone of a dying battery. I tapped on the glass. Arden didn't move. I tapped again, harder. Finally, he lowered the window. The man inside looked nothing like the titan of industry who had been laughing at the gala 2 hours ago. His hair was disheveled, his silk tie was loosened, and his eyes were darting around as if looking for a trapdoor in the floor of the car. "The hangar is closed, Arden," I said, leaning my arms on the door frame. "And the jet is grounded. I took the liberty of notifying the FAA that the corporate insurance policy for this tail number has been suspended due to an internal fraud investigation. They won't let the pilot even start the engines." Arden let out a jagged, hysterical laugh. "You think you've won? You think this is over? I have lawyers who will eat you for breakfast. I have connections in the Ministry of Finance that you can't even dream of." "You had connections, Arden. Connections are built on the expectation of future profit. Right now, you are a liability with a very public paper trail. No one is going to answer your calls, not the Swiss, not the board, and certainly not your friends at the ministry." I reached into the car and plucked his phone from the center console. He tried to grab for it, but he was slow, his movements hampered by the cramped space and his own exhaustion. I held it up, watching the screen glow with dozens of missed calls and urgent messages. "I took the liberty of sending a final blast to your entire contact list while I was chasing you," I said, my voice devoid of any heat. A link to a secure folder containing the original contracts, the offshore ledgers, and a very clear audio recording of you explaining to Leo how you were going to erase me. It's trending on the industry boards already. You're not just a disgraced executive, Arden. You're a case study in failed hubris. Arden slumped back into the seat, his gaze fixing on the dashboard. "Why didn't you just take the buyout? You would have had enough to live 10 lifetimes. It was never about the money, Arden. You know that? It was about the work. It was about the fact that we built something together. and you decided my contribution was a footnote you could delete. I'm just restoring the original text." "And Leo?" Arden whispered. "What about your own brother?" "Leo is exactly where he belongs, in the rearview mirror." I turned away from the car and looked back toward the road. I could see the blue and white lights of the private security patrol approaching in the distance. They would find him here, in a dead car, at the gates of a world he no longer belonged to. There would be questions, there would be a long night of statements, and there would be the slow, grinding machinery of the legal system. I walked back to my SUV, feeling a strange sense of lightness. The sarcasm that usually fueled my internal monologue had faded into a quiet, analytical peace. I had predicted every turn of this evening, every frantic move Arden would make, and every hesitation from Leo. It was a successful experiment. The variables had been controlled, the catalyst had been introduced, and the resulting reaction had been exactly as predicted. As I drove away, leaving the flickering lights of the airfield behind, I checked my tablet one last time. The corporate accounts were being frozen by the board's emergency auditors. The Swiss firm had issued a formal statement distancing themselves from Arden Weller. The erasure was being reversed, but there was still one piece of the puzzle left. The gala had been the public execution of his career. The chase had been the end of his freedom. But the final confrontation, the moment where he had to face the true scale of what he had lost, that was still to come. He still had a house. He still had the illusion that he could salvage a personal life from the ruins of his professional one. I reached for my phone and dialed Clara. She answered on the first ring. "Orion, where are you? The news. It's everywhere. They're saying Arden is under investigation." "I'm on my way home, Clara," I said, my voice steady. "The optimization is nearly complete. I just need to finalize one more thing." I hung up and accelerated into the dark. The city was waking up, the early morning commuters starting their day, unaware that a corporate empire had been dismantled in the hours while they slept. I felt a surge of energy, a sharp, cold clarity. The underdog hadn't just survived. He had redefined the game. The road ahead was clear. Arden and Leo were behind me, trapped in the wreckage of their own greed. I was moving forward, the architect of a new reality where the names on the door were exactly where they were supposed to be. The boardroom of Vanton Weller was situated on the 42nd floor, a suspended cage of glass and brushed steel that felt less like an office and more like an observation deck for the end of the world. By 10 a.m., the atmosphere inside was thick enough to choke a gargoyle. Every member of the board was present, their faces varying shades of ashen gray and high-octane irritation. They sat around the mahogany table like a jury that had already decided on the sentence, but was still debating the most efficient method of delivery. I stood at the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the city. From this height, the cars looked like bloodless ants, and the people were invisible. It was a perspective Arden had always loved. It made him feel like a god. I just liked it because it reminded me that everything, no matter how massive it seemed, had a scale that could be measured and managed. The double doors swung open, and Arden walked in. He was flanked by two men in dark suits, lawyers he'd clearly retained in the frantic hours since the airfield. He had tried to pull himself together. His suit was fresh, his hair was slicked back, and he carried a leather portfolio like a shield. But the mask was slipping. There was a twitch at the corner of his left eye, a rhythmic tick that betrayed the mechanical failure of his composure. Behind him, Leo trailed in, looking like a man who had spent the night in a wind tunnel. "This meeting is an unauthorized farce," Arden announced, his voice echoing off the glass. He didn't look at me. He kept his eyes on the chairman, a silver-haired shark named Arthur Sterling. "I am still the CEO of this firm, and I have not authorized an emergency session of the board." "Sit down, Arden," Sterling said, his voice as cold as a deep-sea trench. "You aren't the CEO of anything right now. Your administrative access has been revoked, and your fiduciary authority is currently under review by a third-party forensic team. You're here as a courtesy, and because we have some questions regarding the $48 million currently sitting in a holding account in Zurich." Arden sat. He sat heavily, the leather of the chair creaking under his weight. Leo sat at the far end of the table, as far away from Arden as possible, trying to look like a confused bystander. I turned away from the window and walked toward the head of the table. "Good morning, everyone," I said, my tone conversational, almost light. "I see we're all accounted for, even the silent partners." I tapped a remote on the table, and the massive integrated display at the front of the room flickered to life. It didn't show revenue charts or growth projections. It showed a map of our internal server architecture. Specifically, it showed the unauthorized Ghost network that had been running parallel to our primary systems for the last 6 months. "What you're looking at," I said, walking toward the screen, "is a masterclass in corporate embezzlement. Arden, with the assistance of a few well-placed intermediaries, created a mirror of our proprietary protein sequencing data. He wasn't just planning to sell the company, he was planning to steal the engine and leave you all with the empty chassis. "That's a lie," Arden shouted, half rising from his chair. His lawyer placed a restraining hand on his arm, but Arden shook it off. "Orion is bitter because he was being transitioned into a secondary role. He's sabotaging the Swiss merger out of spite." "The Swiss merger is already over, Arden," I said, tilting my head. They sent over a formal withdrawal of their offer at 8 a.m. It turns out they have a very strict policy against buying intellectual property that is currently the subject of an active investigation by the Bureau of Financial Crimes. The room went silent. The word investigation hung in the air like a heavy curtain. "I've spent the last few hours coordinating with the forensics team," I continued, pacing the length of the table. I stopped behind Leo, who flinched as if I were about to strike him. I simply rested a hand on the back of his chair. Leo was kind enough to provide the final encryption keys. It seems he realized that his loyalty to Arden was a depreciating asset. Arden turned a shade of purple I hadn't seen before. He looked at Leo, his mouth working, but no sound coming out. The betrayal was complete. The circle had closed. "But we aren't just here to talk about the theft," I said, my voice dropping an octave. "We're here to talk about the humiliation. Arden, you spent years convincing this board that I was a liability, a brilliant but unstable scientist who couldn't be trusted with the big picture. You used my focus on the lab to paint me as an absentee founder. You tried to erase my name because you couldn't stand the thought that the science guy was the only reason this company had any value at all." I clicked the remote again. The screen changed to show a live feed of the company's internal messaging board. It was a chaotic mess of employee reactions. Thousands of people, the lifeblood of Vanton Weller, were watching the collapse of their CEO in real time. I had ensured that the evidence of his double dealing was leaked to every department. "You didn't just fail the board, Arden. You failed the people who work for you. You tried to sell their futures to fund your exit strategy. And the best part? You did it using the very security protocols I designed. You used my locks to hide your secrets, forgetting that I'm the one who kept the master key." Arden leaned forward, his hands shaking. "You think you're so smart, Orion. You think you've won. But you've destroyed the company. There's nothing left. No merger, no Swiss capital, no reputation. You've burned it all down just to see me crawl." "Actually," I said, walking back to my seat, "the company is in excellent shape. Now that the toxin has been identified and removed, we can begin the recovery. I've already been in contact with our secondary bidders, the ones you ignored because they wouldn't agree to your private kickbacks. They're still interested. More interested, in fact, now that the leadership is being optimized." Sterling cleared his throat. "Orion is correct. The board has already voted. Arden, you are terminated for cause. Effective immediately. We will be pursuing full restitution of the diverted funds, and we will be cooperating fully with the authorities regarding the offshore accounts. Leo, your contract is also under review, though your cooperation has been noted." Leo looked like he wanted to thank him, but he saw my face and stayed quiet. Arden stood up. He looked small. The expensive suit, the high-rise office, the power, it was all gone, stripped away by a series of logical progressions he had been too arrogant to see coming. He looked at me, and for a second, I thought he might try something physical. I stood my ground, my hands at my sides, watching him with the detached curiosity of a biologist looking at a specimen. "I made you," Arden whispered. "No," I replied. "You managed me. There's a difference. And as it turns out, I'm a very difficult asset to manage." As Arden and his lawyers were escorted out by corporate security, the room felt like it had been scrubbed clean. The board members began talking all at once, a frantic hum of damage control and new strategies. They were already looking at me, expecting me to take the lead, to be the one who stabilized the reaction. I ignored them for a moment. I walked back to the window. Down below, the world was still moving. The sun was higher in the sky, glinting off the glass towers of the city. I felt a profound sense of satisfaction, but it wasn't the hot, roaring joy of a victor. It was the quiet, steady hum of a machine that had been repaired and was now running at peak efficiency. The underdog was gone. The science guy was gone. There was only the architect. I turned back to the table. "Gentlemen," I said, cutting through their chatter, "let's get to work. We have a lot of history to rewrite, and I'd like to get started on the first chapter." The next few hours were a blur of signatures, statements, and strategic pivots. I watched as the board members, the very people who had been ready to sign my professional death warrant 24 hours ago, now hung on my every word. They needed me. They needed my intellect, my stability, and most importantly, my name. The Vanton name was no longer a footnote. It was the brand. As the meeting finally broke up, Sterling stayed behind. He looked at me with a mixture of respect and something that looked a lot like fear. You played that very well, Orion. I didn't think you had it in you to be that surgical. It's just chemistry, Arthur, I said, packing my tablet into my bag. If you know the properties of the elements involved, you can always predict the explosion. I just made sure the blast was contained. And Arden, what happens to him now? He'll spend the next few years in a series of very expensive rooms, talking to people who get paid by the hour to tell him he's still important. But he'll know. Every time he sees a Vanton Weller logo, every time he hears a success story from this firm, he'll know that he was the one who was erased. I walked out of the boardroom and through the office. The employees were still buzzing, but as I passed, the room went quiet. It wasn't the silence of fear, it was the silence of recognition. They knew who was in charge now. I took the elevator down to the lobby. My phone buzzed. It was a message from the security firm I'd hired to watch Arden's house. Target has arrived home, motion sensors active, legal servers delivered, the public humiliation was over. The professional destruction was complete. Now, it was time for the final, private reckoning. I had one more move to make, one more variable to resolve. I stepped out into the bright afternoon sun, the heat of the city rising up to meet me. I felt alive. I felt sharp. I felt like a man who had finally found the right equation for his own life. The wrought iron gates of Arden's estate swung open with a slow, mechanical groan that sounded like a weary admission of defeat. I drove up the winding cobblestone path, my headlights cutting through the twilight. The house was a sprawling monument to excess, all glass, white stone, and architectural arrogance. It was a house built on the assumption that the person inside would always be looking down on everyone else. Tonight, however, the lights were dim, and the sprawling structure looked less like a palace and more like a mausoleum for a reputation that had expired at noon. I parked my SUV directly behind Arden's remaining vehicle, a heavy SUV he'd rented to replace the aquatic ruin in the city garage. I didn't rush. I sat for a moment, checking the final updates on my tablet. The board had officially ratified my position as interim CEO. The forensic audit was being picked up by every major financial news outlet. The narrative was set, the evidence was ironclad, and the reaction was reaching its peak. I stepped out of the car. The air was cool, smelling of damp earth and expensive mulch. I walked to the front door and didn't bother with the bell. I used the emergency bypass code, a legacy of the security system I'd helped him install when he first moved in. The lock clicked with a crisp, metallic finality. The foyer was silent, smelling of floor wax and the stale remains of a lifestyle that was about to be auctioned off. I followed the sound of a rhythmic clinking toward the study. I found Arden sitting in a leather wingback chair, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He wasn't wearing the tuxedo anymore. He was in a rumpled shirt, his sleeves rolled up, looking like a man who had been trying to outrun a storm and had finally realized he was out of breath. "You really don't know when to stop, do you, Orion?" he said without looking up. His voice was thick. The edges of his words frayed. "I stop when the equation balances, Arden. We aren't there yet." I walked to the center of the room, standing under the massive crystal chandelier that probably cost more than my first 2 years of college. "I notice the movers haven't arrived yet. You should probably get a head start. The board's lawyers are filing the asset freeze tomorrow morning. By Monday, this house will be property of the corporation." Arden finally looked at me. His eyes were bloodshot, the arrogant spark replaced by a dull, flickering resentment. "You took everything. My company, my name, my brother. Even the Swiss are threatening to sue me for misrepresentation. Are you satisfied?" "I didn't take your brother, Arden. You bought him, and he simply realized your currency was losing its value. And as for the rest, I didn't take it. I just stopped lending it to you. You were living on credit. Intellectual, moral, and financial. I just called in the loan." I walked over to his desk, the one where we'd signed the founding documents for Vanton Weller. I ran a finger along the polished edge. "I remember when we started. You told me that I provided the spark, and you provided the fuel, but you forgot that fuel is consumed by the spark, not the other way around." Arden stood up, his glass shaking. "You think you're so superior because you play the long game, because you sit in your lab and wait for the right moment to strike, but you're just as hollow as I am. You spent 24 hours destroying a man you called your best friend. What does that make you?" "An observer," I said, my voice steady and cold. "I observed a corruption in the partnership. I analyzed the data, identified the source of the rot, and I excised it. It wasn't emotional, Arden. It was necessary. You were a variable that was causing the entire system to fail." I pulled a single sheet of paper from my pocket and laid it on the desk. It was a copy of the final settlement agreement I'd drafted. "Sign this. It waives your remaining shares in exchange for the board dropping the private civil litigation. You'll still have to deal with the federal authorities, but you won't be spent into the ground by corporate lawyers before you even reach a courtroom. Arden looked at the paper as if it were a venomous insect. And if I don't? Then I release the second folder, the one that shows the kickbacks you took from the construction firm that built this house, the one that shows you've been double billing the company for research that was actually your private vacation in the Mediterranean. I was being surgical earlier, Arden. If you don't sign this, I'll be catastrophic. The silence in the room was absolute. Arden looked at the pen on the desk, then at me, then back at the paper. He knew I wasn't bluffing. I don't bluff. I only present facts. He picked up the pen, his hand trembling slightly, and scrawled his name across the bottom. He threw the pen down, and it skittered across the floor, disappearing into the shadows. There, he spat. You have your company back. You have your legacy. Now get out of my house. It isn't your house, Arden. It never was. It was a facade built on someone else's labor. I picked up the paper, folded it neatly, and tucked it away. I'll have Leo's things sent over to his new apartment. He's going to be working in the logistics department for a while. A very junior position. He needs to learn the value of a foundation. I turned to leave, but stopped at the door. I looked back at the man who had tried to erase me. He looked small in that big chair, surrounded by the ghosts of a life he hadn't earned. One last thing, Arden. I've updated the security codes. You have until midnight to pack a suitcase. After that, the system will lock, and the authorities will be notified of a trespasser. I'd suggest you start with the shoes. They're the only thing in this room that actually belong to you. I walked out of the study and through the silent house. I didn't feel a surge of triumph. I didn't feel a rush of adrenaline. I felt the quiet, profound peace of a job completed to specification. The variables were resolved. The debt was settled. The equilibrium was restored. As I stepped out onto the porch, I saw a familiar figure standing by my SUV. It was Leo. He looked older, the boyish charm replaced by a weary, hollow expression. Is it done? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. It's done, Leo. He signed the waiver. What happens to us now, Orion? To the family? I looked at my brother, the man who had been willing to watch me be ruined for a few $1 million and a faster car. The family is a structure, Leo. Like anything else, it requires maintenance. You're going to spend a long time doing the heavy lifting. If you work hard, maybe in a decade, I'll let you sit at the table again. But for now, you're just an apprentice. I climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. Leo stood there for a moment, then walked toward his own car, his head down. I watched him in the rearview mirror as I drove back down the cobblestone path. The gates closed behind me with a final, echoing thud. I drove through the quiet suburban streets, the city skyline glowing in the distance like a promise. My internal monologue was silent. There was nothing left to analyze, no more sarcasm to deploy. I had taken the wreckage of a betrayal and used the pieces to build something stronger, something more resilient. I reached the highway and accelerated, the hum of the tires on the road a steady, rhythmic pulse. The light of the morning was beginning to gray the edges of the horizon. A new day was starting, and for the first time in 15 years, I was the only one holding the pen. Arden Weller would survive. It would thrive. It would be a monument to what happens when you try to remove the core from a system that was designed to endure. I thought about the lab, the quiet hum of the centrifuges, the clean, clinical smell of discovery. That was where I belonged. Not in the boardrooms, not in the chase, but in the work. I checked my watch. 5:30 a.m. The first shift would be arriving at the facility soon. I decided to head there instead of going home. I wanted to be there when the doors opened. I wanted to see the look on the researchers' faces when they saw my name back on the directory. Not as a ghost, but as the foundation. As I merged into the early morning traffic, I caught my reflection in the mirror. I looked tired, but my eyes were clear. The underdog was gone. The victim was gone. There was only Orion Vanton, and I had never been more certain of my place in the world. The revenge was complete, not through violence, not through chaos, but through the relentless application of the truth. I had dismantled a lie and built a reality in its place. And as the sun finally broke over the horizon, painting the world in shades of gold and fire, I knew that this was the only ending that made sense. The cycle was closed, the experiment was over, the results were definitive. I drove toward the light, leaving the shadows of the estate and the echoes of the betrayal far behind. The road was open, the system was stable, and for the first time the future was exactly as I had designed it. No epilogue was needed. The action had reached its peak, the climax had been earned, and the story ended where it began, with a man, a vision, and the unwavering conviction that some names can never be erased.